Hello, Isaac here. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're doing well. It's been a while since I've made a video, but I'm hoping to start creating content again. So I really appreciate your support and feedback. So please do like, comment, and subscribe. Okay, let's get into this video. So my plan is, in the next few videos, is to do a series looking at the inclusion of Gentiles in the early church. And particularly, we're looking at chapters 10 to 11 of the book of Acts, which is also known as Acts of the Apostles. Now, for those that don't know, the book of Acts is about the early church and what happened to the disciples of Jesus after his resurrection and ascension. And the book is believed to have been written around AD 60 to 90, and the author is traditionally attributed to Luke, at least, the companion of the Apostle Paul. In fact, the use of the first person plural at certain points in Acts suggests that he was present with the Apostle Paul during his travels. And Paul, in his letters to Philemon and Colossians, refers to Luke as both a co-worker and friend. So, the book of Acts begins with Jesus commissioning his disciples to be his witnesses. After his resurrection, Jesus appears to his disciples and tells them, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." This commissioning is given just before Jesus ascends into heaven. Therefore, disciples are called to be his witnesses to the ends of the earth, and they will receive power from the gift of the Holy Spirit, which will enable them to do this. This Spirit is the presence of God on earth, which had previously resided in the temple in Jerusalem, but it now empowered this diverse group of disciples to become a new temple, with a mission to extend his presence throughout the whole of creation. And so, this mission will be to the ends of the earth, but somewhat surprisingly for the disciples at least, this includes the inclusion of Gentiles, of non-Jews. This is first foreshadowed in Acts 8 with the Philip preaching to an Ethiopian eunuch travelling to Jerusalem, and in Acts 9 with the conversion of Saul, whom the Lord describes as an instrument whom I have chosen to bring my name before Gentiles and kings and before the people of Israel. But what happens in Acts 10 to 11 is foundational to the Gentile mission, for Peter will preach the gospel to his first Gentiles, Cornelius and his family, and what God reveals to Peter through this experience becomes incredibly important. In fact, it lays the groundwork for the mission to the Gentiles itself, and for the Jerusalem Council of Acts 15, in which Peter, Paul, Barnabas and James, along with the whole church, meet to discuss the question of circumcision, a practice required for all Jewish men, and establish an authoritative decree which rules that Gentiles do not need to be circumcised and obey the whole law of Moses in order to be saved, and therefore they do not have to become Jewish to become full members of the people of God. And so, with that in mind, let's begin with the two visions of Acts 10. So in Acts 10, we are introduced to a man in Caesarea, a centurion called Cornelius. This centurion is described as a devout man who feared God with all his household. He gave alms generously to the people and prayed constantly to God. In other words, Cornelius seems to have identified somewhat with the Jewish community and exemplified some degree of commitment to their God, and adopted some distinctively Jewish practices. But although his Jewish piety would have been respected and appreciated, it is certainly not orthodox, and certainly not on the level of proselyte, which included circumcision and full observance of the Mosaic law. He is, for all intents and purposes, still an outsider in relation to the people of Israel, but if anything, a friendly outsider who wishes to know their God and to be joined to their people. So we are told in Acts that one afternoon at about 3 o'clock, this Cornelius had a vision in which he saw an angel of God coming and saying to him, "Cornelius." He stared at him in terror and said, "What is it, Lord?" And he answered, "Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. Now send men to Joppa for a certain Simon who is called Peter. He is lodging with Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the seaside." This Peter, also known as Simon, is one of the 12 apostles of Jesus. And God reveals to Cornelius to go and find this Peter. Therefore, Cornelius sends a devout soldier and 2 slaves to find Peter in Joppa. Now, in Joppa the next day, while Cornelius's men were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter himself had a vision. Now he went up to the roof to pray, and we are told that he became hungry and wanted something to eat. But whilst the food was still being prepared, he fell into a trance and had a vision. Now, this is what the text tells us about the vision in Acts 10, 11 to 15. He saw the heaven opened and something like a large sheet coming down, being lowered to the ground by its 4 corners. In it were all kinds of 4-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air. Then he heard a voice saying, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean." The voice said to him again, a second time, "What God has made clean, you must not call profane." This happened 3 times, and the thing was suddenly taken up to heaven. Therefore, Peter sees this vision of both clean and unclean animals, but he hears a voice saying, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." Peter is obviously shocked by this, for it violates his understanding of Torah, and for this reason he refused 3 times to obey this, referring to the laws of Leviticus 11 regarding clean and unclean animals to justify his refusal. Now, as a quick side note, it's important to understand that it was no small thing for Peter to eat unclean food and transgress the food laws. For Jewish people preferred death to eating unclean food. Now, this particularly came to the fore in the Second Temple period, the events that happened under Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who ruled the Seleucid Empire from 175 BC. Now, he sought to suppress Jewish practices, which included Sabbath and circumcision and the kosher food laws. And in 2 Maccabees 7, shortly before the revolt of Judas Maccabeus against him, it tells us of a story of a woman and her 7 sons who would rather die than be forced to break the Jewish law and eat pork. Now, in this story, this mother literally watches each of her sons die in the most horrific manner before she is put to death for refusing to eat pork. So again, it's no small thing to transgress these laws. But with that in mind, we must ask, what does this vision mean? Is Peter really being called to ignore the law of Moses, which Jewish people have sacrificed much to uphold, and eat things that are considered unclean? Well, with that in mind, let's see what happens next. And so, Peter is puzzled. What does this vision mean? Well, whilst he is still pondering this, the men sent by Cornelius arrive, and the Spirit indicates to Peter that 3 men have arrived looking for him. At the door, Peter inquires why they are looking for him, and they say in Acts 10:22, "We have come from Cornelius the Centurion." He's a righteous and God-fearing man who is respected by all the Jewish people. A holy angel told him to ask you to come to his house so that he could hear what you have to say." And so the next day they travel to Caesarea, and Cornelius, along with his relatives and close friends, are waiting for him. Strangely though, Cornelius falls at the feet of Peter and starts worshipping him. Immediately Peter tells him to get up, for he is only mortal. But this indicates at least the mixed up religious framework of Cornelius. For although he shows some level of worship to the Jewish God and has adopted certain Jewish practices, he's still a Gentile. And in the Greco-Roman tradition, there are many divine heroes. And Caesarea itself, which is predominantly a Gentile city in Palestine, is named after the divine emperor Caesar Augustus. And so Gentiles like Cornelius do things like offering a form of worship to Peter that ought to be shown to God alone. But despite the apparent idolatry of this Gentile, Peter enters the home of Cornelius. And it is precisely at this point that it clicks for Peter, and he understands the meaning of this vision that he's had. In other words, the vision is not about consuming unclean foods, but it is about associating with and accepting unclean idolatrous Gentiles and engaging in actions such as entering the home of a Gentile sinner and sharing in a meal with them. As Peter says in Acts 10:28, "You yourselves know that it is unlawful for a Jew to associate with or to visit a Gentile, but God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without objection. Now may I ask you why you sent for me?" Later, when Peter recalls the same events to the apostles in Acts 11:12, he says that when 3 men appeared, the Spirit told me to go with them and not to make a distinction between them and us. Now, to put it differently, Peter does not interpret the vision as an indication that he can eat whatever he chooses. In fact, he realizes that the vision is about Gentiles, and the instruction to eat clean and unclean food is a metaphor for interacting with and accepting unclean Gentiles. This analogy, as Richard Borkham writes, is deeply rooted in the Jewish tradition. It derives ultimately from Leviticus 20:22-26, where the distinction between pure and impure animals is said to represent that between Israel and the Gentiles. And so we see that Jewish food laws were intended to keep Israel socially separate and symbolize this separation between immoral Gentiles and Jews. Therefore, in and of themselves, the food laws didn't prevent Jews from associating with Gentiles. When visiting the home of a Gentile, for example, they could abstain from eating any meat and wine that was offered to them, to avoid consuming unclean food or food that had been sacrificed to idols. This is exemplified at least in the book of Daniel, where the protagonist, a Jewish statesman taken into captivity to the Babylonian court, determined to do this, abstaining from defiling himself with the royal rations of food and wine. Instead, Daniel chooses to consume only vegetables or seeds. But despite this, the food laws were perceived symbolically as a way to separate Jews from the other nations. Therefore, through the symbolic reversal of the Torah's instruction to make a distinction in Peter's vision, he understands that he can now associate with and visit the home of a Gentile. When Peter does enter the home of Cornelius, he asks them why they have sent for him. Cornelius simply repeats his vision, which led him to send for Peter, saying in Acts 10:33, "So now all of us are here in the presence of God to listen to all that the Lord has commanded you to say." In other words, Cornelius doesn't know why Peter's here, but assumes that he must have something important to say from the Lord. And so, Peter realizes that he has been surprisingly called to tell this Cornelius as well as the other Gentiles that are present, about the good news of Jesus Christ, his life, death, and resurrection, and that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name. Now, there are two things which Peter says which I think is necessary to delve deeper into. First, he says that Jews do not associate or visit a Gentile. And secondly, the given reason for this is that they are profane or unclean. In terms of the first point, that Jews do not associate with Gentiles, it was often a charge levelled by Greco-Roman authors against the Jews, as they were described as antisocial because they don't mix with or share table fellowship with non-Jews, as Tacitus writes at the end of the 1st century AD. The Jews are extremely loyal to one another and always ready to show compassion, but every other people they feel only hate and enmity. They sit apart at meals and they sleep apart, and although as a race they are prone to lust, they abstain from intercourse with foreign women. In fact, Josephus in his book Against Apion responds to the criticism of Molon Apollonius that Judeans do not wish to share fellowship with those who choose to live according to a different way of life. And he not only accepts this as true, but he defends it. He argues that there is good precedent for a policy of restricted social intercourse, even amongst the Greeks, and that Plato and the Spartans and the Scythians all prohibited mixing with outsiders on the basis that the state should remain pure, consisting of those faithful to its laws. In other words, the point of this restricted social intercourse with foreigners is to protect their own customs and laws and to prevent innovation from creeping in. But this does not mean that the Judeans were unfriendly towards outsiders. In fact, they would not, like the Spartans, refuse to grant citizenship to residents among them. Instead, Josephus argues that they gladly welcome foreigners to come join the Judean people if they wish to share their customs and laws. In other words, they need to be admitted in the usual way any proselytes are, which is by circumcision, if they were male, and by undertaking the Mosaic law. Only then will there no longer be restricted social interaction. Another interesting example of this comes from the Book of Jubilees, a pseudepigraphal work from the 2nd century BC. Now this work retells the story of the creation to Moses, and it has Abraham, in his last speech before his death, summon Israel to separate themselves from the nations, which includes not eating with them, as it states in Jubilees 22:16. Separate yourself from the Gentiles. Do not eat with them, and do not perform deeds like theirs, and do not become associates of theirs, because their deeds are defiled, and all their ways are contaminated and despicable and abominable. So we see that the reasoning for the separation from Gentiles is essentially the same as that of Josephus, which is the negative influences of associating with them. But Jubilees is more explicit in the use of purity language, like Peter, as it describes their deeds as defiled and contaminated, which it then connects explicitly to the worship of idols. So it says that they slaughter their sacrifices to the dead, and to the demons they bow down, and that they wander astray, saying to the tree, "You are my God," and to the stone, "You are my Lord, and you are my Saviour." And that all those who worship idols, and for the hated ones there is no hope in the land of the living. Besides a prohibition on associating with Gentiles and eating with them, it also emphasizes that they should not take a wife from any of the seed of daughters of Canaan. Now the reasoning for this is the same, of this defiling negative influence. We also find the community rule of one of the sectarian texts of the Dead Sea Scroll community, that it tells us that even insiders, that is, Jewish members of their community who sinned and broke the community rules, are banned from the community's pure food and their communal meals. Now this perspective is evident in the Gospels, in Jesus' interaction with the Pharisees, for they repeatedly expressed their disapproval at Jesus' habit of eating with tax collectors and sinners. For example, in Luke 5:29-30 it states, "Then Levi gave a great banquet for him in his house, and there was a large crowd of tax collectors and others reclining at the table with them. The Pharisees and their scribes were complaining to his disciples, saying, 'Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?'" Therefore, many first century Jews, but especially the Pharisees and the Qumran community, avoided close social interaction with Gentiles or even Jewish sinners, which could mean not visiting their homes or sharing meals with them. And this is because of the possible negative influence they could have, which is often explained in the language of purity. That is, that they are unclean or profane. But what do these categories of unclean and profane actually mean? Well, that is what we're going to explore in the next video, as we look at how these concepts are understood in the Hebrew Bible and then developed within Second Temple Judaism. We will then draw out the implications of this and for what Peter means when he says in Acts 10:28, "But God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean." Okay, thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. And again, please make sure you like, comment and subscribe. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one. So thank you. Bye.